Early Chinese civilization. The objectives are: 1. Characterize the rise and fall pattern of Chinese dynasties. And 2, identify how the 3 schools of thought about the nature of humans and the universe emerged. Now first, let's begin with geography, just like we have in all other ancient regions. The Chinese geography is much like what we've seen in other ancient regions in Mesopotamia or in Egypt, where the first civilizations arise around river systems. So the Huanghe, which is the Yellow River, stretches across China for more than 2,900 miles. And it's called the Yellow River because of a silt that has a yellow consistency and color that is deposited along the shores. And this stretches from Mongolia to the Pacific Ocean. Now, the other is Qiangyang, which, again, I'm going to be mispronouncing some of these, or the Yangtze River, which empties into the Yellow Sea. And so these 2 major rivers are going to really be the focal points for the ancient civilizations emerging in these regions. Now, geographically speaking, as a total whole, only 10% of the total land area is suitable for farming, compared with the 19% of the United States, which is roughly around the same size. And of course, what that means is that you have a huge space, but with very little arable land. And what's interesting is that China has a huge population, as we'll see. Now, of course, what is the rest of that 90%? We're talking about mountains and deserts. Now, of course, what's interesting about the East Asian region is that you have incredible geographical barriers. That is, mountains and deserts and seas and oceans that really isolate the Chinese people from the rest of the world and from parts of Asia throughout. You have the Himalayas to the south and mountain ranges and deserts to the west. You have deserts to the north, ocean to the east. So largely in terms of antiquity, these people are truly developing an isolation. Not the quasi-isolation that you see in Egypt, but a true isolation. Now, contact with the Chinese were often marked by conflict, the northern frontier in particular. The northern frontier of China became one of the areas of conflict in Asia as Chinese armies tried to protect their precious, scarce farmlands, usually from nomadic invaders to the north. And so we're going to see that this is really going to be that one possible entry point into China. Now, first, let's look back at ancient Chinese civilization. Now, there is, of course, long kind of mythic dynasties that emerged some 4,000 years ago, particularly the Xia dynasty. But largely this is myth to a huge degree. And what the first major dynasty that we end up seeing is the Shang dynasty, which emerged from 1750 to 1045 BCE, which is largely a farming society ruled by an aristocracy, that is, an upper class whose wealth is based on land and whose power is based on that land from one generation to the next. And so this aristocracy is really ruling and controlling the region, and the primary family, the Shang family, are really the ones who are dominating the region in terms of control among that aristocracy. Now, some of the ideas of the political and social structures going on here are going to have a lot of parallels to other places in the world. The king was responsible for defending his realm and controlled large armies, which often fought on the fringes of the kingdom against incursions and against barbarians trying to penetrate into China. Now, these kings, what's significant, communicated with the gods through the use of oracle bones, which should be similar, I think, to some of the traditions that we end up seeing in Mesopotamia, for example, where there seems to be a correlation between the kings and the gods, as if the gods would listen to the kings only and rather than the regular people. Now, interestingly enough, in China, this is the means by which writing ends up getting developed. But the idea that the kings have an intimate, close relationship with the divine kind of reinforces the social and hierarchical structures that existed within Chinese society. Now, the king and his family were at the top of Shang society, supported by the aristocracy and the gods, and ruled over the peasants. Now, also, we're going to see that the religion and culture in the Shang really reinforced these sorts of traditions. So we see early Chinese had a strong belief in life after death, and this was true for all people. And so remains we see of human sacrifices were found in royal tombs to some degree as well. But from this belief in the afterlife, we come to the idea of the veneration of the ancestors, or ancestor worship. That one family would want to revere their ancestors that have come before them and their spirits. And so how would one do this? They would practice burning replicas of physical objects that they may accompany the departed on their journey to the next world. Or it was important to treat the spirits well through offering smoke sacrifices or food sacrifices, making sure that your family is cared for, even in the afterlife. So again, this concept of the afterlife still being connected to some degree to the present reinforces the idea religiously that one should be dedicated to their family and to their lineage, and particularly to their patriarchal structure, that is, to the father and to the male. So the religion is really intimately involved in the social structure of the Shang dynasty. Now, inevitably, we see that the collapse of the Shang, through rumors at least, of mismanagement, that the Shang rulers were wicked tyrants who swam in ponds of wine as the entire Chinese society collapsed around them. Now, of course, these rumors and these problems, particularly associated with the invasion and incursion of barbarian tribes from the north, this led to the aggressive ruler of the state of the Zhou to revolt against the Shang and establish a new dynasty around his family, the Zhou family. And this Zhou dynasty lasted for 800 years, which is the longest lasting dynasty in Chinese history. Now, it's interesting that the Zhou used this as a means by which to seize power. They used religion and social structure. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit. But the political structure in particular, the Zhou dynasty continued the political structure of the rulers that had come before the Shang. And of course, the idea is that they fashioned, of course, the same system, but made it more complex and better functioning. They fashioned an increasingly large and complex bureaucracy. That is, the king was seen as the link between heaven and earth, and he was able then to divide up authority for the kingdom through bureaus and would give authority to different people to manage those areas. So it became a well-lubricated machine to some degree. But what's interesting is that you have this concept of how the kingship is really the link between the divine and the human. So you can see the religion is being used as a tool to reinforce social structures and political structures in this society. Now, of course, what's intimately involved in this is something called the Mandate of Heaven. The Zhou dynasty claimed that it ruled China because it possessed the mandate of heaven, that is, a contract from the divine. Now here, when they say heaven, what they really mean is an impersonal law or nature through which order in the universe is kept through the Zhou king. So the idea is it's not a literal destination like a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition where it's a place that one goes when they die, but this impersonal divine force. And so one might have the mandate or the contract or the agreement from the divine to rule the empire. Now, the king, of course, was expected through this mandate to rule according to the proper way, that is the Tao, the proper way in which a king should behave. and do things. And so the Tao was the duty to keep the gods pleased, so that natural disaster would be fended off. That if in fact the king had failed, then we would end up seeing the mandate of heaven rescinded from the divine, and that there would be natural disaster and invasions from other people, and earthquakes and famine and disease. And so it really set a cycle that would occur throughout Chinese history. It set a right to revolution for the concept of overthrowing any kind of corrupt or evil ruler that might emerge, whom they would believe the mandate of heaven was seized from. And how would anyone know that the mandate of heaven had been rescinded? If there were earthquakes, invasions, famines, disease. So while this worked for the Zhou, we're going to see that it's going to cause problems for the Zhou later and other dynasties, because inevitably people get invaded, diseases occur, famines happen, earthquakes happen. Right. And so what we see then is that each founder of a new dynasty would say that they had earned the mandate of heaven from a group of people who the mandate of heaven had been rescinded. So a continual cycle will see a new dynasty establish its power, ruled successfully for many years, and then inevitably declined through these various means, through barbarian incursion, through famine, through disease, because of this removal of the mandate of heaven, at least in religious and social conception. Now, inevitably, we see the fall of the Zhou dynasty through this same means. The Zhou kingdom had been divided into several small territories, and some of these territories began to evolve into powerful states that challenged the Zhou ruler. The Zhou ruler no longer had tight control over his bureaucratic divisions of the kingdom. And inevitably, along with this, we see the introduction of iron weapons. We see more powerful, of course, than bronze weapons. And these, of course, came into use through crossbows, another Chinese invention that will really come to dominate the region. Now, what did life look like during the Zhou dynasty? The peasants worked on their lands owned by their lord, much like a feudal sort of knight and kingdom, old medieval sort of thing, but they had land of their own in that territory, which they farmed for themselves. So they had to work their own land and the land of the Lord, who really owned that whole territory that they were being protected by. Now, trade in this period also involved the exchange of local products that were used on an everyday basis with other people. So that allowed for the specialization of labor in some senses. So someone might focus on this crop, or someone might raise these animals. And so locally, you have locally sourced sorts of things. But you also have a shift in the economic and technological changes and growth during this time. You see a significant economic growth in the technologies of irrigation. Particularly, irrigation was in wide use, and large-scale water projects were set into motion. Particularly, we're going to see major efforts to connect the rivers together. So irrigation, channel systems, growth of crops, all of those are going to be major innovations. We're also going to see the use of iron that had led to the development of iron plowshares, which made it possible to plow land that really couldn't be used for farming because the soil was too hard. One of the most important items of trade comes through textile, that is, through silk. Silk was incredibly wealthy and allowed for, and lucrative, of course, and allowed for them to export this commodity, this luxury good, across the world, all the way to the Greeks and the Romans, which of course they're going to be gobbling up, and really becomes the fuel for the intricate trade network known as the Silk Road. We're also going to see shifts in the family in ancient China. Family served as really the basic economic and social unit in general. But at the heart of the concept of family in China, we're going to see the idea of filial piety. That is, the duty of members of the family to be subordinate to the father or the male figure. And really is a system in which each family member had his or her place under that male supremacy. So male supremacy was a key element in this social system of ancient China, largely reinforced by religious ideals. Now, we also see the writing and develop of the Chinese language. Now, of course, it's going to be a result of the religious expression during the Shang, and is the most important cultural contribution of ancient China to later Chinese society. So later Chinese society was, we end up seeing the creation and the development of this written language that is primarily pictographic and ideographic in form. That is, they take symbols, and those symbols represent concepts, rather than the phonetic structure we'll see in later civilizations. And those phonetic structures are based on pictographs to some level, or ideograms that will represent sounds rather than the idea or concept. So the characters and ideograms are characters that combine two or more pictographs to represent an idea. And so one would have to learn thousands and thousands of ideograms and characters to try to understand the language. Now, dealing with some of the most important things next to the written language, we see the emergence of three major philosophical systems that are trying to deal with some of the hard issues of Chinese society at the time. We see Confucianism and Taoism and legalism. Now, Hindus and Buddhists really focused on the human soul and rebirth. It was necessarily a sort of afterlife or heavenly perspective. However, Chinese philosophers were concerned with the immediate world and how to create a stable order right here and now. So you have a completely different concern here. Hindus and Buddhists are interested in the divine and the after place. Right? And the Chinese philosophers are interested in here and now, and how that might create a stable order. And so, in some senses, people say these aren't religions, but philosophies. Now, we don't want to get into that debate per se, but Confucianism really was interested in the here and now. And that seems to be the precepts behind Confucius's teachings. Now, Confucius, known as the first teacher, was born in 551 BCE. And he hoped to become a great political advisor. That's what he wanted to be, but it never occurred. He inevitably had a faithful band of followers who revered him as a great teacher and recorded all the things that he said and composed them into a text called the Analects, which are his sayings and teachings. And so what was built around his sayings, the Analects, is Confucianism, which really is fashioned around his teachings from his followers. Now, China was faced with one basic question: how to restore order to their collapsing society. They had problems, order, social structure, all of those problems. And so Confucius's interest in philosophy was political and ethical, not spiritual. He's interested in how people can live well now, and how can Chinese civilization function now. So the key to proper behavior, in his mind, was to behave in accordance with the Tao. Just like the king had Tao, we all have Tao. That is duty and humanity, the things we're responsible for. And so for Confucius, he saw this Tao in play through 5 key relationships. That is parent and child, husband and wife, older sibling and younger sibling, older friend and younger friend, ruler and subject. In each one of these relationships, each had a role. The parent had to parent well. The child had to obey. The husband had to be a good husband. The wife had to obey. The older sibling had to be a good older sibling. The younger sibling had to obey, and so forth. And so each had their Tao in terms of their relationship. Now, of course, you can see that there are many layers because you can be multiple things. But the idea was that we needed to create a orderly society through the right relationships. Now, Taoism is concerned with a whole different issue. So we have, under Taoism, a system of ideas based on the teachings of Lao Tzu, which is a contemporary of Confucius. But Lao Tzu is going to be interested in a whole different gambit of answers. So the chief ideas of Taoism are really discussed in a short work known as the Tao Te Ching. And the Taoists really believe that the true way to follow the will of heaven is non-action, right? Not acting differently, but inaction. So act spontaneously and let nature take its course by not interfering with it. That is, who you are is who you are, and so behave as who you are, and nature itself balances itself out. So really here we end up getting the kind of yin and yang sort of thing, where all nature balances itself out, and so we shouldn't strive to alter or change who we are. Now, of course, on the complete opposite spectrum is legalism, which proposed that humans by nature were evil. And so the way that we deal with evil people is through harsh laws and stiff punishments. That's the only way that we can bring order to this society. So legalists believed that a strong ruler was required to create an orderly society, an orderly structure through harsh laws. So people, he believed, were not capable of being good because they're inherently evil. And so, therefore, they sought fear in the hearts of people so that they would obey. So the fear of harsh punishment would cause the common people to serve the interests of the ruler. So if you want to rule well, you should instill fear into the hearts of people that they would obey. And this is really the core of legalism. So here you might see really extreme punishments, right? So you stole, have your arm chopped off, right? Or, hey, you happen to slap the queen's daughter or something, you're dead, right? So it's pretty extreme, and it's hard to go into details here, but the idea is that no extreme consequence of the law was too extreme for legalists, because the whole goal was to set an example to the rest of the society so that they would be too afraid to break the law. Now, we just want to refresh then. Our objectives were: 1, characterize the rise and fall patterns of Chinese dynasties. And then 2nd, identify how the 3 schools of thought about the nature of humans and the universe emerged.